observance the historical date of May 20th, 1865, which is Emancipation Day, is what I grew up, and others like me grew up knowing it as, is the date when African Americans enslaved in Florida were freed from slavery.
It's interesting the way that we think about Florida in the modern era. We tend to think of it as less Southern. We tend to associate the state with beaches and Disney and tourism. But the reality is that Florida is quintessentially Southern. It's Southern in every way possible, and that includes our history. Slavery has played a significant role in the development of this state.
As we look at this whole history of emancipation in Florida, we would be grossly remiss and way off the mark if we didn't consider and actually start with the self-emancipators, going all the way back to the 1600s and before that. I mean, I think the first attempt to establish slavery in Florida by the Spanish was in 1526. So in 1693, we have the Spanish King's Edict, where he decides to authorize and encourage enslaved people to come to Florida, where they could serve as a buffer and a defense force to protect the Spanish interest.
When we talk about the early Black presence here, there's a mixed bag. We do have the fact that there was Spanish colonization here with the establishment of St. Augustine in 1565. But within that, there were opportunities for freedom for Black folks. So it's very interesting and very important for us to realize in that in this colonial era, Florida was a site of freedom where African Americans could escape servitude and slavery in the British North American colonies and come and convert to Catholicism in Florida and be able to live lives as free people. That is what makes Fort Mose significant as the first formally recognized free settlement for Black Americans in this colonial experiment. Florida becomes a state in 1845, and it is with statehood that the practices that had already existed in terms of slavery are going to be extended and codified into state law. Florida then and now still has significant agricultural development. There's cotton being grown in the state, other major cash crops, and there is a significant enslaved population that is mainly contained between the Apalachicola River and the Swanee River. By the time we get to 1865, there are approximately 63,000 Black people in the state. Only 1,000 of them are free. So the vast majority of Black people living in the state of Florida are in kind of that old Black belt of the region and are enslaved. As we get into the 1830s and the rise of the abolitionist movement and the 1840s and 50s with more political and social pressure and contest over where slavery should exist or not, the push for the abolition of slavery, you're really going to see this fraying of American society and American politics. And even though in many southern states it was illegal for enslaved Black people to learn to read and write, you best understand that they had their ear to the ground and they understood very clearly that this growing conflict between the Republican Party in the North territorially and the desire to preserve slavery in the South meant that there would be opportunity in that chasm for them to seek freedom. We need to appreciate that the position of the Republican Party, which elected Abraham Lincoln in 1860, was not abolition. That was politically untenable, and they knew it. They were very interested, however, in trying to contain what we knew as slave power. That the outsized influence and economic power that was represented by these southern states. The Southerners, conversely, could not hear that. They only heard that there was abolition coming. And it was the way that they talked about this that convinced their enslaved people that there was opportunity for freedom in this. And so from the very beginning of the outbreak of war in 1861, what you're going to see is that masses of Black people are going to flee to the side of the U.S. Army, later known as the Union Army, in attempts to free themselves. And the Union Army was wholly unprepared to deal with that phenomenon. Even in early phases of the war, they were returning these fugitive slaves back to their owners in the South. It was only when they recognized that their power, their human work was being used to support the Confederacy in their war efforts that they stumbled upon the idea of labeling fugitive slaves as contraband. That would be used to aid the war efforts of their enemy, and as such that they would not return them to their owners. And so when you talk about this process of freedom and process towards emancipation, it's important to recognize the agency that enslaved Black peoples exercised during this period when they recognized what was potentially before them.
The big reason for the enslavement of people in the Florida Keys was the construction of the forts here. A lot of the slave owners here in Key West would rent the people that they own to the government for the construction of those forts.
January 1st, 1863, Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect in very limited areas. It's a piece of paper. It can't take effect until a couple of things have happened. Either federal troops have shown up and control a particular piece of geography, or that they actually have ended the war. And those things don't happen until April of 1865, when there's the surrender of the Confederacy at the Appomattox Courthouse. It's only then that full emancipation as we know it, the news of it, and the enforcement of it can move forward. And it's going to travel at the speed of horseback.
Emancipation Day in Key West was much different. Key West, the Florida Keys, were, for the entirety of the Civil War, under Union control. They were never a part of the Confederacy. And so even though people were enslaved here and they're working on these forts, when Lincoln issued the Emancipation Proclamation, it took a little while for word to get down here, but about 3 weeks after the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, they did get word, and everybody celebrated. Once they realized that slavery's over, they held a big parade and a celebration that says went well into the night. There's this wonderful account of Sandy Cornish leading this parade of newly freed people, hobbling because that's how he walked, because he had actually maimed himself years earlier. But the pride, the joy that he felt, that day had come. And there it was, and he was leading the parade.
January 1st was always the day here in St. Augustine. And so the celebration was immediate after the reading of the Emancipation at the government house here. It was celebrated, and then the people of the town were all called together. It was read to them collectively. And January of 1864, an invitation went out for celebration in St. Augustine at that time. Barbara Vickers, who is now 98 years old, she's still alive in our community. She recalled when she was a little girl how much fun she had staying up and watching the people decorate the floats for the parade. And it was a big deal for her, at that time.
Yes, emancipation does go into effect on January 1st of 1863 with the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. And it was something that was looked forward to with great anticipation by enslaved Black folks. So knowing that this date was coming, this transition from slavery to freedom was coming, there are African Americans who are going to group themselves together, come together in this religious almost observance, waiting for the clock to strike midnight on December 31st, 1862, knowing that the next day that their lives would be changed because of the signing of the Emancipation Proclamation. This happens in areas like Washington, D.C., along the coast of South Carolina, which there's a large federal presence. And we continue to observe the occasion of what we commonly know as Watch Night, watching the new year ring in. Not many people know, it's only been a more recent discovery that that tradition of Watch Night was also a part of the march forward of emancipation. Emancipation was not the intended consequence of the U.S. Civil War. Because of the length of the war, because of the tremendous loss of life, Abraham Lincoln does come to it as an idea that he could put forward as a way, he hopes, to end hostilities, to get Southerners, the Confederacy, to come to the negotiating table. And it's going to be that process, that thought process, that strategy that encourages him to create what we know as the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation. This is September the 22nd, 1863, where he's announcing that in 100 days in those states that are in combat against the United States of America, that all of their slaves would be free. There are some exceptions, of course. There are border states that are exempted from this, and people have pointed that out as controversial. But what you have to understand is that all of this is strategy of a wartime president whose ultimate goal is not to end slavery, but to keep the Union together.
Though the Emancipation was signed on January 1st, 1863, the word did not reach Florida until May 20th, 1865. In the Tallahassee community where the official reading took place, though that reading was to impact the entire state of Florida, over 60-some thousand slaves were freed with that enforcement reading.
After the slaves were freed, they were sometime in a period of frustration because being enslaved all those years like that, they never experienced anything like that.
You had that first phase of, all right, we're supposed to be free, but we're not free yet. And now the soldiers finally show up, the cavalry shows up. Well, okay, what does that mean?
It took over a period of time to get themselves adjusted. You see, when Cook read the Emancipation Proclamation, that was an event. That wasn't a celebration. So it took 2 years before they started celebration at Bull Point, which is now Lake Ella. Bull Point really was a point where the slaves fished. And when they were emancipated in slavery, they went there and had that first celebration. It moved from there over to Winthrop property right across the street over there, and it was celebrated there for 58 years. And then it moved here in 1924. And we've been celebrating the 20th of May for something in this area for about 98 years. What they did on May Day, they planted the maypole, and that was a old English tradition. That was one of the main activities that we did here. And there were some large and majestic pines there. And coming up to the 20th of May, they would take a lime and painted a base of the trees white with lime, and they would decorate the stage, and every young person in the community had to go on stage and say like a poem or speech or something like that. After slavery, the Union soldiers, they didn't have a need for the drum because the war was over, so they didn't need a drum corps. So they gave the drums to the ex-slaves, and the ex-slaves, they designed a unique beat, and they was beating it. The beat lasted for 100 and something like over 50 years. Now, and what happened was the drum beat was a part of every family, and every family taught their young children to beat the drums. When I was 8 years old, my grandfather had the drums, which are in that front room there, and that's the drums my brother and I learned to beat on. And over the years, we became some of the best drum beaters in Leon County.
I recall having a conversation with one of our elders, Mrs. Lila Mitchell, and she mentioned that there was a white gentleman who would donate a whole hog back in the day. The men would dig a pit the night before, and then the whole hog would cook for the entire time, and apparently it was some real good eating back in the day.
Well, I remember when we celebrated it when I was a kid in elementary school. That's how far back I remember. We would go to school that day. I would get to ride the bus to go to New Bethel, and the women would be working all day to get all the food and stuff ready for us by the time we got there.
The first celebration that I knew of as a child growing up, well, hearing it from my parents, took place 2 years later in 1867. And that celebration started on the old plantation place, because now they are free, so we say they were still some on the plantation, so it was held on the plantation. My great-grandmother, Debbie Edwards, along with a good friend of hers, Sarah Hill, started that celebration. We looked forward to going, the children, because there was a lot of playtime, a lot of food. But first they told us why we were there, is to celebrate freedom. And then we would go outside or play around in the old school hide and seek. Coming up, it was just that commonality of history that everybody knew this was an important time. For that reason, I just think it's so important that this particular history does not get eclipsed with some of the today fanfare or hype that's going on as it relates to emancipation.
Emancipation parades kind of went underground, and they ceased in the middle of the Jim Crow era here in St. Augustine. And I can only imagine, after word of what happened in Ocoee and, Greenwood and different places, that, people were fearful for their lives.
As best as I can tell from the oral histories that I've conducted, you do see a decline in the veracity of these 20th of May celebrations over the years. I link it, based on the chronology, to the desegregation of schools. When schools were segregated, Black principals, Black teachers had the ability to make it a school holiday and to incorporate it into the curriculum, to release students from school, to transport students from the school grounds to the communal celebration locations. A lot of that control they will lose when schools are desegregated, and you now have white administrators and white teachers determining this holiday schedule. And so it's really about then, even though we have Brown versus Board of Education in 1954, the reality of desegregation in Florida does not play out until the 1960s and 70s, and it's going to be about that time that you see in the central part of Florida these celebrations really fading.
A lot of hearing about it came about because of Juneteenth. As Juneteenth became more popular and began to be observed more in different places around the country, that's when you started hearing more that, well, that was Texas. What about our story here in Florida? This was a very profound experience, and something not to be brushed aside, something not to just be a footnote in history.
There is kind of a contest in some people's mind between the recognition of May 20th in Florida versus Juneteenth. I think for sure we want to make sure that we preserve and pay tribute to the history of the events that took place in our state. Most especially those communities, those tradition keepers, those community folk who invested their time and energy each year to make sure that these were festive occasions for the community. Many of these were women. So when we talk about the role of women in weaving the fabric of community, we have to place the 20th of May and those celebrations firmly within that context. The other part of it, though, I think when we think about Juneteenth, it's important to recognize the kind of culmination, symbolic as it may be, of the announcement of the Emancipation Proclamation. I love the old adage that until all of us are free, none of us are free. And so in my mind, celebrating Juneteenth also has real significance. All of these holidays together, whether you're talking about the 20th of May, Juneteenth, or the 4th of July, all have a very important place in helping us to tell our national history. Not everyone entered our body politic, our society, this American democracy at the same point, in telling a more complicated story about America, and specifically understanding our transition away from chattel slavery into emancipation and this long road towards freedom that we continue to move along. All of that is important, and our public holidays have a role in telling that story.
I think it is important to continue to celebrate history. To forget the past denies future generations and present generations their heritage and a foundation for hope. Plus, for me, I think that knowing history and understanding it is at the root of intelligence.
It puts us in a position where Emancipation Day is kind of important in its own right, but it's also important as a vehicle, if you will, that connects us, that opens the way for us to reclaim that greater picture, that greater understanding of our being, our existence, our purpose.
Emancipation is not a frivolous event. It's solemn, it's sacred, and that needs to be taught and passed on.
As a young public historian working with the John Riley Museum in Altham Barnes, that was one of my first professional tasks, was to help to organize the commemoration of Florida Emancipation Day. We were very interested in recreating what we know John Gilmore Riley had done when he was principal at Lincoln Academy, which was have his students come and decorate the graves of the U.S. colored troops who were buried in Old City Cemetery. That then rolled into a commemoration at the Knott House that is still going on today. Move forward a few more years, and then in 2021, with the federal recognition of the Juneteenth Independence holiday, there became real concern here in the state of Florida among historic preservationists that this new federal holiday would overshadow nearly 160 years of domestic emancipation celebrations here in the state of Florida. And what I recognized in talking to Ms. Barnes and Natalie King and others is that we hadn't done the best job of educating people. We needed to really coordinate our efforts to make sure that we had an authoritative source of information for the citizens of Florida to really help them to understand this history that so many of us held dear, but we needed to make sure that more people knew. And so this 20th of May Digital History Project is our effort to make sure that we preserve the history, preserve the stories, and document Florida's historic Emancipation Day. It's wonderful really to see what I would class as a resurgence of the 20th of May celebrations. A lot of this I grounds in credit to the John Gilmore Riley Museum, the Florida African American Heritage Preservation Network, as well as the Department of State, which has been a real champion of the holiday, both on the web and through the annual celebrations that are held at the Knott House Museum. And we now see more prominent celebrations taking place throughout the state, where we're bringing people together, we're helping to educate them. For a lot of our elders, it is a return of something that has faded over the years. One really positive outcome of this work is helping to spread the word and create more celebration, more curiosity, more research, and more actual celebration of the 20th of May across the state of Florida.